All right. So what's that saying? I think don't bite the hand that feeds you. I think that's a good saying for this episode.
I think there's so many sayings here. Don't poke the bear. Like, don't do all the things. Say, don't dig the hole deeper. That's going to be that. Like, even as we're recording this, Strava is actively digging the hole deeper. Like in the last 20 minutes. So
Okay.
we have a
All
lot to
right.
talk
So,
about.
yeah. All right. So basically, we have a pretty spicy one for you here today. So Strava has decided to sue Garmin and specifically over two patents that we'll talk about here in just one bit. But they're also demanding that Garmin cease selling their devices as well
Yep.
with these two features in them. So, anyways, incredibly spicy because we're talking about like two behemoths in the sports tech world. So we're going to go ahead and get into it in just one second, but this is the Fitfile podcast for any of you who are just like tuning in. So we have DC Rainmaker on the other end here. I'm DesFit, and we talk about anything and everything sports and health tech related. If you're listening on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, we're also available on YouTube where you can switch back and forth between the video and audio versions. But let's just get straight into this one.
Yeah, so there's two core things that they're upset about, and there's two core patents. Each one of those patents has some like ancillary, secondary patents, but we'll just go into two core patents since that's all that really matters here. And as you noted, they're demanding, as a result of this, that the court, the judge, etc., rule that Garmin's devices that have these capabilities be pulled off the shelves, no longer imported, all this kind of stuff, right? So this is essentially all of their fitness devices, including their cycling computers, etc. But the only thing that wouldn't fall under the category here of this from a Garmin fitness realm would be something like a heart rate sensor or a tax trainer, right? But even Garmin Connect as a platform is also called out here as well as a bunch of features there around routing. Almost everything around routing and mapping they're asking to be yanked as well.
So there's really two features that are in question here, and that's going to be heat maps. So these are essentially popularity-based routes that you'll see on a map where this is going to be from user-generated data. So, think about like the huge community of Strava users as well as Garmin users where, you're uploading all your data to these platforms and, they're able to aggregate this all and show essentially like, which routes are going to be more popular for different users, which is going to be great for all of us just because we can see, all right, these are going to be the better routes to take, whether that's going to be like more epic routes or just, like safer routes, stuff like that. And then there's the other portion of this, which is segments. So these are essentially like portions within a route, or, think like stop sign to stop sign, where you could essentially have like a start point and end point, and you could either race against yourself or you could race against others. So those are the two features in question here, but there's a whole lot of like timelines surrounding these things too, in terms of which company actually came out with this first, as well as which company actually publicly disclosed these and when the patents were actually filed. And this is the part where it's kind of funny. So I think, the first thing is that both of these things basically existed around 10 years ago, like from either company, whichever way you want to debate it, it was like over a decade ago. But they're finally just bringing up this tussle now, 10 years later.
Yeah, things have been calm for 10 years, like singing songs at campfires, the whole bit, right, for a decade. You've been at some of those. You've been at Strava Camp, right, where Garmin and Strava have been there together, literally singing songs at campfires, right? Like that is the actual definition of Camp Strava. Everything was fine until it wasn't in the past few months. And we'll get to like what happened, but I think first we have to lay down the explainer on this and basically talk about the two core patent areas and then talk about what's changed, what Strava thinks is going to happen, and then probably most importantly, how Strava's rumored IPO that they're trying to launch is probably playing into this. So
Totally.
let's start off on the patent side. I think probably with the heat map patent makes the most sense.
Yep, totally. So like I was just talking about earlier, this is like, based on user generated data and in terms of like, showing the most popular routes. But if you want the actual legal definition here, I think this is generating user preference activity maps is disclosed, including collecting a plurality of user activities recorded by a plurality of GPS recorded devices. blah 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 blah, and basically it's like it's a user preference map in the whole scheme of things.
Yeah, this is essentially them saying any data collected from a GPS device, they're going to overlay it onto a map. That's the really simple version of this. So this is where the timelines start to actually matter quite a bit. And I know this can be a lot in timeline-wise, so we will go in order as best as possible. In the case of Strava, they filed for this patent. There's a filing date and there's basically the granting date. They filed for this patent on December of 2014, and they were granted it in 2016. There was a secondary patent that came along in 2016 and granted in 2017, but for the purpose of our discussion, that doesn't really matter here. But the kicker is that Strava actually didn't have heat maps before Garmin. In fact, Garmin was the first of the major companies to have heat maps all the way back in March of 2013. So a year and a half prior, Garmin Connect announced their heat maps for US cities. And like I included some screenshots that I took back in 2013. Like these are crazy old screenshots that I had on the site.
Yeah.
And like some fun graphic design here, but it's a heat map and you can turn and toggle layers on and off inside Garmin Connect. And that was there then. Then that was followed up in June of that year by a third-party site called RaceShape. And this third-party site basically took underlying Strava data using the Strava API. This was back in the heyday when Strava like encouraged this sort of stuff. In fact, I even found some threads on Y Combinator with one of the patents, the named patent inventors, commenting on this whole thing, right? So like they were totally cool with this. Back RaceShape basically took the underlying Strava data and then made a heat map out of it. Because again, Strava didn't have a heat map in early or mid 2013. So that heat map then allowed you to see the cycling data, running data, etc. on there. Now, at that point, I think Strava probably got the picture they should do something as well. So in September 2013, they launched personal heat maps. And that is where you could see your own Strava data, but could not see other data. So this is more of a kind of like fun, like, ooh, look where I went sort of thing than it was for route discovery beyond that. So we're talking essentially a year behind when Garmin had their heat maps. And now, again, then it was another year until they got around to filing a patent for this. And so generally speaking, when it comes to patents and filing, there's a couple things that we'll get into around timelines later on for the segments portion of it, but you have almost a year between public disclosure and when you can file the patent. That's given a little bit of leeway. Now there's a lot of variability to that, and that's like where you get into a lot of the legal aspects of, you know, whether or not they would accept that year delay. In this case, it's unlikely because their competitors launched these things first and then Strava came along and tried to patent it. But even if we used that year defining marker, it is trivial to go and find examples from 2012 before the one year prior marker, right? So before the 12-month prior grace marker that showed people using Runkeeper, so a name, you know, way back from when there, and heat map data in doing this sort of overlay stuff. So this was not new, this was not novel, this was not something that Strava should have ever gotten away with getting a patent for. But that gets back to the challenge that we've talked about in past episodes between Zwift and Wahoo, for example, on how patents are granted. And, you know, generally speaking, a company will go ahead and put together a patent package. They will send that off to PTO, the US Patent and Trademark Office. Fun fact, I used to live right next door to that gigantic complex when I lived in DC. And even they have a museum there you can go into. They had a sports tech museum for a while. I have like an entire post on it. But that office will basically decide whether or not to grant you that patent. The problem is that examiners are hit or miss on whether or not they do the research. Some examiners are great. Some examiners will basically just rubber stamp things, especially when it comes to prior art. So prior art is these sort of things here, where did this exist somewhere else in the world prior, or does it pass like an obviousness test? You know, and those are the two core things we're looking at. In this case, it's absolutely clear that there was no prior art looked at for this, because this would have been easily invalidated. And then you get to the second piece of this whole thing, which is claims. So claims when it comes to patents is this whole list of things that determine what actually defines a patent, right? So something may be obvious to you and I, but it's the implementation that matters. And if you look at the technical claims here, they are very, very broad and very, very basic, right? There's nothing that's novel or new or super creative about what Strava is doing from a heat map standpoint.
Well, so I think again, though, it's like it goes back to the fact that it's been over 10 years since this was incepted by whatever company at this point. So it's like, I mean, I don't know the whole like legal like statute of limitations sort of things in terms of like actually bringing this stuff up, but it seems like a long, long time from now. And what's interesting about this particular feature, though, is that with heat maps, I would say that with both Strava as well as Garmin, it is actually an important feature that a lot of people probably use on both platforms because, in terms of when I build a route on Strava or Garmin for that matter, is that I certainly utilize the heat maps feature. So it's definitely important for both platforms, but I would say for Strava, it's even more important, and they certainly have even more data, of course, because they're aggregating data from not just Garmin but plenty of other devices out there. But this, I think, will probably be a recurring theme throughout this episode is that Strava, I would say, needs Garmin more than Garmin needs Strava. And,
Way
in
more.
terms of, yeah, it's like we don't know the exact numbers or anything like that, but I'm just going to put out a guess that the majority of data on Strava is probably coming from Garmin devices.
Or more importantly, I can confirm that as of relatively recently anyways, the vast majority of vast majority of Strava paid users were data sourcing from Garmin, meaning that
Mhm.
if you were a paid user on Strava, your data, there's a solid chance that that is actually coming from Garmin as opposed to anything else. And
Yep.
so, yeah, that's where it gets really really interesting. But I think getting the statute of limitations aspect of it, if you will, why this far later on? Actually, before we talk about segments, I did think about one thing. Kind of not entirely done on the heat side of it. One of the things that you could use while you're out in the heat is actually Precision Fuel and Hydration, the sponsor of this podcast. In fact, this past just 2 days ago, I was out on a 70-kilometer hike, and with that, I was using Precision Fuel and Hydration products to get me through that hike, minus a bag of gummy bears, of course, because why not?
Because gummy bears.
Yes, but it's not just me, it's also the Tour de France teams, both the men's and the women's side, Major League Baseball, NFL, NBA, etc. And of course, my wife, as she's training for all of her events as well. But one of the cool things about Precision is that they're willing to have a conversation with you, not willing, they're excited to have a conversation with you about your particular training or event that you're training for, your race, etc., and figure out the products that work best for you. So you can actually have a 20-minute Zoom call with them and walk through that event and figure out what the right products are for you. They also have a race intake planner, and if you're in one of the locations, you can do sweat testing, for example, the upcoming 70.3 World Championships, as well as the Ironman World Championships here in the next week or two. You can do those on site there too, and a bunch of other locations around the world. Now, all their products are Informed Sport certified, all are vegan, all are 2-to-1 glucose, fructose, and contain no artificial ingredient. And most importantly, they're actually edible. Even 14 or so hours into my hike, I had no problem consuming some of them just to try to minimize the impact of that hike later on to keep those calories flowing in. It may sound like counterintuitive to do that at the end of the hike, but it's actually super important from a recovery standpoint to get those things in. You can visit the link in the description for the free fuel and hydration planner or get 15% off your first order with coupon code FITFILE. Thanks again to Precision Fuel and Hydration for sponsoring this episode. Let's then dive into the segment piece. So the next patent that Strava's upset about is basically their core identity, right? The existence of a Strava segment and how you define that and from a technical stance and whatnot. And the thing is, I don't think anyone disagrees that this is Strava's patent, right? If you look at how they did this and all this kind of stuff, there's no real disagreement that Strava was the first from a technical implementation there on this. I'm not aware of anything before that. Certainly the concept of earmarking a time up a given segment, if you will, is not new. That's the Tour de France in a KOM jersey, right? That's going from the start of a climb to the top of a climb. Strava just simply took that in a technical realm. But one of the things that their patent covers is aspects like how you look at the GPS data at the start of the segment versus the end of the segment, and so you become more lenient at the start as to how you kind of funnel this in and later on. So I don't have any problems from a technical standpoint. I will note, however, that from a pure patent filing perspective, they waited 2 years after they publicly disclosed this before they actually filed that patent. So Strava as an entity existed as of 2009, and they had Strava segments as of 2009, so that whole concept existed publicly then, and users were on the platform by then. But it wasn't until 2011 that they went and actually applied for a patent on this. And from a patent standpoint, generally you are granted, in the US, you are granted a 1-year waiver, if you will, after public disclosure. So it's sort of the inverse of the previous 1-year thing we talked about earlier on, which is 1 year prior. In this case, it's 1 year after. This is well beyond the one-year realm in this case. And even that 1 year isn't a guarantee, right? It's not like you're always going to get that waiver depending what's going on. So I could see how Garmin or any other entity could argue that this could be invalidated based on the fact that Strava just took too long to get around to patenting it. That said, we then skip ahead a few years, right? So now you move your way into 2014, and Garmin's releasing the Edge 1000. And as part of that, on Garmin Connect, Garmin created Garmin Segments, which was more or less a duplicate of Strava Segments on Garmin Connect. Like, you have a leaderboard, you create a segment, you could do all this stuff. And in particular, on the Edge 1000, you could go ahead and race that particular segment on Garmin's devices and platforms, so totally within Garmin. And this is because, I know it's probably hard to remember this or imagine this, but back then the idea of Strava Live segments did not exist. It didn't exist on the phone.
Till
It
a
didn't
year
exist.
later. Yeah.
Yeah, it didn't exist at all. So this was purely Garmin going, well, we don't have an API to pull this data from Strava, so we're just going to simply let users create their own segments. They don't necessarily match Strava's, and it's as simple as that. The problem is that no one wanted Garmin segments, right? And so it floundered, right? Just like it's still
Yeah.
technically in the product today. It's in every single
Sure.
Garmin device today, almost every device basically, but no one actually wanted it. So less than a year later, Garmin and Strava formed what's called the MCA, or Master Cooperation Agreement. So that was in April of 2015, and what that basically defined is how these two companies work together to go ahead and implement Strava segments on a Garmin device. So that then resulted in Strava Live segments launching on the Garmin Edge 520 on July 7th, 2015. So like less than 3 months later, which tells you this was already in the works before then, because Garmin especially wasn't going to be able to roll out Strava Live segments on brand new devices hitting the market in less than 3 months. And so that was there then.
Now, correct me if I'm wrong here, though. So did Garmin actually come up with the live segment idea versus, so basically extending the segment idea into actually like showing it on the device, where Strava came up with the segment idea first? Is that and basically they kind of came together to like bring those two things together?
Right, that's the gist of it. There were attempts at live segmenting, if you will. I think even Wahoo demonstrated that for the first time, actually, before Garmin did. Wahoo did it for their kicker trainers, so this is before even their bike computers were out. The idea that you could race a segment, that was something that they had done, but had never been done on a bike computer out in the wild. This is all about like training and stuff like that. So yeah, there's kind of two pieces to there. And now, where it gets messy is this MCA. And so this agreement here, unfortunately, is not uploaded to all the legal documents yet. I'm hoping that at some point one of these two sides uploads it, though I'm going to bet they aren't, because Strava alludes to it a few times in this document and alludes to the fact that there is a whole bunch of limits that they put in place, according to Strava, again, around what Garmin could do with Garmin's segments. And as part of that, Strava is claiming that Garmin was basically supposed to cease development of the Garmin segments on their device and platform. And to Garmin's credit, they did. Like, Garmin segments haven't changed in a decade, right? So Garmin technically ceased development, but they also put it on every other device since then for like the 7 people left on the planet that didn't want to sign up for Strava Premium, because this feature did require Strava Premium to work. So you had to have a Strava Premium account, and then you could do the live segments. So if you didn't really want to pay for Strava, you could still basically recreate those segments if you were really into segments on the Garmin side, and then race them, and then have that data eventually just sync over to the Strava side later on.
So it's kind of funny that they're having a tussle over these segments feature for sure. I mean, is it almost just like they're just trying to add a little bit more fuel to the fire?
That's the thing, is that when you look at the segments, or look at the patents, that Strava has, they only really have basically 20 or so patents as part of this entire portfolio. They don't have a lot of things compared to Garmin, which has thousands of patents. So I think the next piece then is to look at why Strava is actually suing Garmin. Like, what are they actually upset about right now?
There's a portion of this that I wanted to bring up really quick before you actually get into those specifics. So this is from the reply that you got from Strava. So the reply that you got from Strava when you asked them for a comment is that, while we can't provide additional comment on the suit at this time, we encourage you to read the complaint, which provides a full background of Garmin's actions and infringement. Regarding timing, so this is the portion that I found really interesting. Regarding timing, we reached out to Garmin repeatedly over a period of several months to resolve this amicably, and were rejected. So Garmin has been increasingly aggressive to its partners lately, blah, 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 blah. So anyways, the timing of these basically was that they informed them on June 30th of 2025 and July 25th of 2025. So again, this happened, these were incepted over a decade ago, but they only informed them this summer. So what happened this summer then, right?
So what happened this summer? On July 1st, Garmin implemented their new Garmin Connect API policies. And this policy is literally in a direct response to Strava's API changes last fall, right? So we won't rehash the entire Strava fiasco last fall, but like in 10 seconds or less, Strava basically told all the partners to take a flying leap, all their API developers take a flying leap. And as part of that, there's kind of two key things that Garmin was upset about. One was that Strava was basically saying partners couldn't do training on, from an AI standpoint, on the data that's there. And Garmin saw that as this is the user's data. The partner can do whatever they want with it at that point. And then two, around attribution. And Strava basically said that, if you're going to use Strava data somewhere, you need to label it Strava data. And in most cases, you can't even show it, et cetera. And so Garmin was upset because, again, they saw this as, hey, this is actually Garmin data, not Strava's data. In fact, it's even more than that. It's the user's data. So that led to this update of the API policy back on July 1st, which is relatively minor. All it says is that if you are displaying data that came from Garmin via the Garmin API, so if you synced it automatically from the Garmin account to Strava, to any other platform, doesn't matter, Strava, then you need to put somewhere on the screen there that the data was sourced from a Garmin device. It's as simple as that. The exact same thing you would see at the bottom of Google Maps. The exact same thing where it says, all the providers talking the exact same thing there. In fact, Strava themselves has to do that already with mapping providers. You'll see Mapbox on there and whatnot when they do that data sourcing. This is no different than that. That's all Garmin was asking for. And other developers, every developer I've talked to so far was like, shrug, sure, whatever, no big deal, right? Just not a big deal. This was a very big deal to Strava. They were displeased, to say the least, about this. Now, from a timeline standpoint, in the case of last year's Strava fiasco, Strava gave developers 30 days before they cut them off. Garmin told developers that you basically had 6 months, but they were kind of like, look, if you can get it done in 7 months, that's fine too. If there's a problem, like they weren't super hard up about it. It was one of those just, let's get this done together. We'll figure it out together. Get it done when you can. So this wasn't like a hard stop sort of thing, which is the brush that Strava is now trying to paint it into. But that is what sort of set this in motion. And then ultimately on July 25th, Strava basically formally notified Garmin again that they were now in violation of these patents from 10 years ago, right? Which is bonkers, absolutely bonkers.
Now, did this also have something to do with Garmin's Trail Plus rollout as well? Because I mean, in terms of a Strava-like feature, I would say Trails Plus is similar for sure, but I would say it could also fall in the same camp of Garmin segments, where I'm not sure how many people will really use the Trails Plus feature.
Exactly, yeah. Trails Plus was launched back in May, and it's more or less just a rehash of existing Garmin features under the Connect Plus umbrella. And don't get me wrong, it's cool in some ways if you're in one of the regions that supports it, but it's not a massive feature. I can see, though, how Strava saw this as an affront to their routing features, which is probably how the heat maps and routing pieces got like pulled into this, right? That'd be my guess, but who knows? So I think that it's worthwhile talking about the update Strava just published in the last 20, 30 minutes now, which they published to Reddit. And so they published to basically the Strava Reddit subreddit there. It's from Matt Salazar, Strava's chief product officer, and the title is "Setting the Record Straight About Garmin." Right? Mind you, I received comment from Strava. Like I had reached out to them last night, as well as reached out to Garmin. Garmin basically came back with a new comment, but Strava actually had some comments, which we've already kind of brought off some of those. But in this case, basically, Strava is literally saying here this has nothing to do with these patents. This has to do with retaliation for the July 1st developer guidelines. And they straight up say that. And they say there's two core things. They say we consider this to be blatant advertising. And they say as part of that Garmin requires the Garmin logo be present on every single post, screen, graph, image, sharing card, etc. That they have until November 1st to comply. If not, Garmin has threatened to cut off access to the API. We will set aside the fact right now that that's actually not what the developer guidelines, which you can go read. You can read them yourself. They're public. They're on the site. They say they simply have to list Garmin as a source, but no logo is required whatsoever. So then there they say there's two core reasons why they're suing. One, they say we consider this to be blatant advertising, and they go on to a bunch of blah, blah, blah. And then they say, we consider this to be your data. If you record an activity on your watch, we think that is your data. We believe that you should be able to freely transfer or upload that data without requiring logos to be displayed alongside it, or have the data be used as an advertisement to sell more watches. Which, like, that is beyond ripe, right? That is literally the same thing that they demanded for all their partners a year ago with the API Fastgo. That is why Trailforks had to delete 60 million activities out of the Trailforks database, reducing the usefulness of Trailforks for that exact reason right there. Like, what?
This seems like when you're having like an argument with your partner about emptying the dishwasher correctly or something, and then they bring up the fact that you accidentally stared at this girl in a short skirt or something like that, like 10 years ago. That's, that's what this kind of seems like.
This is 100%. In fact, everyone on the internet is like, mom and dad are fighting again, right? Like, this is 100% what this is at this point. But it's crazy. As you might expect, Reddit, as of right now, is having none of this, right? Reddit is completely just absolutely slaughtering them in the comments, because this is precisely what Strava said. The whole thing is just bonkers.
Okay, so I mean, this is obviously a mess. It seems like Strava is kind of made for itself. So I guess really the question is, what happens next? And I think there's so many possibilities here, right? So I mean, I think that there could be action taken. There could be action taken by Garmin even before any of these actual court rulings actually like go into play. So I don't know, like in the worst case scenario, Garmin could just like pull its API from Strava, like, essentially like, not having Garmin activities go into Strava. Extremely unlikely, but I mean, hey, it could possibly come to that. But then I guess there's actual outcomes of the court ruling, like maybe let's say Garmin would have to pull its heat maps functionality, their segments functionality, in the case that they would lose. But then there's also the possibility of like, what if Garmin wins? I mean, that would possibly mean negating some of these patents on Strava's side of things, which seems like a pretty bad outcome for Strava at that point.
Oh yeah, and I think this gets a little bit to the IPO aspect, right? So Strava has been, rumored and talking about doing an IPO, so going public with the company. And one of the things that investors like to see is that there's some sort of things that Strava has ownership of from an IP standpoint, patents, etc. As I noted earlier, Strava doesn't have that many, 24 by count of what I could find, but sometimes patents are like listed under different company variants over time, so they're kind of hard to find, like, Strava, LLC versus Strava something else, etc. Right? Like, that can change over the course of a company's life cycle, especially for early patents, where they could be in the wrong category. So number could be higher. Either way, it is way smaller than Garmin. That's all that matters here, right? We're talking Garmin, probably thousands of patents at this point. But investors like to see that. And there's some speculation that Strava is basically trying to notch a win here that can show developers they can defend these patents that they have. They just chose the wrong thing to go against, right? Like, if you're going to go against another company for heat maps or segments, why wouldn't you choose a smaller random competitor, right? Not to like throw Ride with GPS under the bus here, but like, why would you choose Garmin? You're choosing a company that has an incredibly strong history of not losing patent battles. Like, if you search Google the last time Garmin lost a patent battle, best I can tell, it was like 2011 for a Pioneer like audio case, long time ago. They have settled a few smaller, like very minor things since then, so that could be considered a loss. But Garmin gets attacked all the time, like literally almost every other month around patent claims, and they virtually never lose them. Like, this just seems like it was asking for it. But more importantly, you're suing your best and biggest partner. Like, these two companies were so close together on so many things, and now they have sued them, which is going to basically stop any hope that Garmin would do basically product development type stuff for Strava anymore. So these features, and Strava has a new thing, Garmin's gonna be like, no, we're not. No. Like, why are we going to help you out here? This is no. And so every single new feature that Strava had launched over the last decade, generally speaking, Garmin was the first one to implement it, whether it be Strava Live segments or beacon integration or all these crazy things, right? Those are all things that Garmin did first with Strava as part of that master cooperation agreement. And that is now so far beyond dead. You look at even like the little things, like I imagine that an email was sent out yesterday to all Garmin employees that said that if there is any communication with Strava, then legal has to be on that chain, right? Even if it's just a technical
Totally.
support thing going back and forth, right? I imagine there are so many things that were just immediately walls put in place that are now going to hurt things all across the board there.
It just seems to me that this is very, very poor timing, like you said about the IPO, rumors going around that with any of these outcomes, I mean, it seems to me that this would be a long shot for Strava to win, these cases. But if they lose, like just the chances of actually this devaluing their company is just gigantic, considering the prospects of the IPO.
Oh, exactly. I think just to me, the risk reward here is so bizarre, right? You just sit there and go, the reward for winning this was what? Like what was your reward for winning this lawsuit at the end of the day? Nothing, right? Like there's
Yeah.
no Garmin segment users, so shrug. At worst, Garmin takes these features out and goes shrug. The routing side, I would argue, was a bigger deal, but they were going to lose that anyway, so whatever. But the risk is massive here, right? If Garmin were to go today and say, you know what, we're just going to disconnect the API, like that would almost immediately sync Strava, right? For them to kill connectivity to Strava and sync to Strava would virtually immediately kill tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of, not hundreds, if not millions of Strava users that were paying for a subscription going, why would I pay for a subscription anymore if I can't use my Garmin data? Like
Another thing is okay. Let's say Strava does win and the Garmin has to cease selling their devices again. That's a loss for Strava, in the whole scheme of things. That's a complete loss for Strava. So I would have just loved to be in the meetings in terms of when this decision was made on Strava's end of things and how the outcome could be positive.
every single person I've talked to in the industry has just been completely befuddled by this in the last 24 hours. They're just like, from a legal standpoint, this made no sense. From a strategy standpoint, it made no sense. The only viable scenario people have kind of floated is the idea that maybe the master cooperation agreement expired the 10-year marker this past spring. They're trying to negotiate, and then maybe Strava was trying to gain the upper hand, but Strava chose the wrong bear to try to gain that upper hand with, right? Like that's
Well, and not just a bear, but like a bear that was their best friend for a long, long time. And I think this just kind of goes back to the fact that again, like Strava would certainly not exist in its form that it is today without Garmin ever. Like there's just no way. Now, in terms of today though, like, let's just put that, in theory that let's say Garmin goes away for some reason. Strava could still exist, but in no way the capacity that they could potentially be at, so it's just absolutely nuts to me. It's just one of those like, wait, you decided to do what? You really did that?
absolute, complete and total crazy pants. But yeah, let's be honest, that is like Uncle Strava, right? Uncle Strava has consistently over the years, just when you think you're having a calm September day, they come along and they're like, here, hold my beer, right? And here we are.
Oh man. All right. Well, this is obviously going to play out, in the next coming weeks, months. Who knows how long this is actually going to take to actually resolve. So definitely stay tuned. We'll have more information on that, and Ray will definitely have more information on his website. And if you haven't checked out his video or his post already on this, it goes through all these nitty-gritty details that we just talked about here. And this was I think when you texted me yesterday, this was the emergency podcast episode that we needed to
Emergency
film.
podcast, yep. We convened.
Convened, exactly. So we do have some other episodes. I still have that Whoop episode that I will have done. It's so close to the finish line. So that will come out after this one, and then we need to loop back to all of Techtember because Techtember is just like bonkers. So I mean, there's so much to talk about, and I think we still have a bit of backlog on our own end of things, and that's ultimately why we haven't been doing podcast episodes. Unfortunately, is that we just have so much of our own content we need to actually get out. But we promise we will loop back to all those other episodes.
Thanks everyone for watching. Again, you can see us on YouTube. Of course, you can see all of our goodness there. You can also find us on Spotify as well as Apple Podcasts.
Yep. Thanks so much. All right. Talk to you later.